environmental science program here at Hilo. And I'm also in the Listening Observatory for Hawaiian Ecosystems lab under Pat. And then as Pat said, he is my primary advisor, Dr. Patrick Hart, and my committee members are Dr. Jonathan Price and Dr. Elliot Parsons. So just to kind of give you a little bit of an outline of what I'll be talking about today, first of all, I'm going to go into an introduction, kind of just over Hawaiian birds and the project. Then I'll dive into the movement aspects of my study, looking at home range, habitat use, and some of the breeding biology that I observed over the last few years. And then finally, I'll be talking about some of the work that I did with vocalizations, looking at the repertoire, and then the geographic and individual variation of the three populations that I looked at, of the three ʻAkiapōlāʻau populations that I looked at. So just to give a little bit of an introduction on the birds of Hawaiʻi, na manu hoʻiwi. In the past, there was this really diverse community of native birds, everything from forest birds to seabirds to predatory birds, migratory birds, the whole gambit. We had hundreds of native species that were only found in these islands. Unfortunately, though, over time, we've had this really long history of extinction. And in Hawaii, we've had more extinction than any other land area on the planet, an estimated 77 species in the last 700 years. And the first wave of extinction was driven by the first arrival of Polynesians in Hawaii. And this really affected our lowland, flightless, and dry forest species. But then following the arrival of Europeans and the introduction of a lot more invasive species that are a lot more aggressive, we started losing a lot of our flighted forest birds, a lot of our water birds became much more endangered, and many of our seabirds disappeared very rapidly. And even today, over 1/3 of our endangered species of birds are found in Hawaii nationwide. And if you look here at the images, you can see all of the red X's are species that are extinct, and this just represents a small fraction of the total overall birds that we've lost. And then the yellow circles represent birds that are endangered or threatened, and the red circles represent birds that are now critically endangered. And so a lot of our species here in Hawaii are really hanging on by a small thread. And so that's really why it's important to continue to look into the life history and other behaviors and things regarding these species so that we can better protect what remain. And then just to kind of talk about a little bit more about what got us to this point are these major threats. So probably the biggest one for our forest birds is mosquito-borne disease, and that comes in the form of primarily avian malaria and avian pox. And then number 2 is invasive mammalian predators. So that's another big one that's impacted many different species of birds, but particularly our forest birds and our seabird and our terrestrial species of birds. And then finally, habitat loss is another major impact on the bird species, whether it was clearing for agriculture or for logging and ranching. And then non-native ungulates such as sheep and pigs have really decimated a lot of the habitat. And then invasive plants like strawberry guava have come in and removed a lot of the remaining habitat. And one thing that is, and here I just really want to highlight the mosquitoes. It literally only takes one mosquito bite to do in one of these birds. Here you can see this is an adult male kiwikiu that unfortunately was killed by avian malaria. And then just to drive that point forward a little bit further, these two images show some forests, so different examples of forest bird communities. And this is based off of a typical point count survey that you would do. So the image on the right is what you would expect to count in an 8-minute survey in a really nice pristine forest, say at Hakalau Forest National Wildlife Refuge. And the image on the left is an area, it's still a pristine, beautiful forest with great habitat, but there's mosquitoes present. And you can see it just has this wildly aggressive impact on the bird populations in the areas. And then all of the mosquito factor has had the biggest impact on our honeycreepers, especially our fruit and seed eating species, which today only the palila remains, but it disproportionately impacts this group of birds because they had been here for so long and had been isolated for so long that they lost a lot of the ability to fight off these infections. And that brings me into the group of honeycreepers that I was looking at from my project is the heterobills. And so this was a group group that was pretty diverse historically. There was at least one species found on each island. But today, unfortunately, the nukupu'us and then this really cool subfossil bird, the giant scimitar-billed nukupu'u, are extinct. And they no longer, so they can't be found on any of the islands besides Maui and Hawaii Island, where on Maui you have the kiwikiu, which is the closest living relative of the ʻAkiapōlāʻau, my study species, which I'll talk about a little bit here. So for those of you who don't know, the ʻAkiapōlāʻau is this bright yellow to kind of gray-green finch, but they have this really neat, so this is where the heterobill comes in. They have this really neat bill where it's almost twice as long on the top mandible, and then they have this short, stout lower mandible that they use for excavating into the bark of primarily koa trees and extracting the large beetle larvae that live within the tree. So in an effect, this bird, this finch, has adapted to fill the woodpecker role ecologically in the islands, and it's the only species in the world that has this type of bill structure. So it makes it really, really unique. It has really unique behaviors, and it's just a fantastic bird to spend some time with in the forest. And so just to kind of get into what I was specifically looking at for my study questions for movement, I wanted to know how large ʻAkiapōlāʻau home ranges were. And then I wanted to look at what is the density of these birds within the Pu'umaka'ala Natural Air Reserve. How many birds can the NAR potentially support? And is there any seasonality in habitat resource use? And does it potentially vary by sex? And I really wanted to target these things because we're using a new technology, but I'll get into that in the methods. And then for vocalizations, I really wanted to characterize the vocalizations of ʻAkiapōlāʻau, because up to this point, there's been very little study done on their vocalizations. And then I also wanted to see if song variability was linked to the population or to the individuals. And then also I wanted to see if there's any seasonal patterns in vocalization, because currently most Hawaiian forest birds are surveyed in the spring when they're thought to be the most vocal and most active. And so if we found that maybe ʻAkiapōlāʻau had a different vocalization pattern, it may impact the population estimates and when it may be best to survey for them across the landscape to develop better population estimates. And so for my predictions for the movement, I was thinking that ʻAkiapōlāʻau would display some seasonal shift in home range size and resource use. And then I also was thinking that resource use may display some seasonal variability between males and females. And that's just from like initial observations of watching the birds forage. Like the male birds tend to hang out on larger koa branches, whereas the females will tend to hang out in the smaller branches. And so I thought perhaps there would be some seasonal change or even just some difference in habitat use between the sexes. And then vocalizations, I'm pretty sure that song variability will be greater among populations rather than within populations. And based on, again, on some preliminary observation, vocal activity will vary seasonally. So then just to talk about why do we care about home range? And the reason it's important is because you can determine the size of the area used by animals. And this is really important, especially when you're dealing with these endangered species, because you can figure out how many are on the landscape, and you can also figure out ways to improve the habitat so that you can increase the number of these birds. Like ʻAkiapōlāʻau only number at about 1,000 birds, and so anywhere we can make gains into increasing their population is a big step in the right direction. And then also you can figure out the total density of birds on the landscape. So and then from that you can apply that to other areas where you're not specifically looking at the species to inform a little bit better the population estimate across their range. And then why track birds? So previously work with ʻAkiapōlāʻau has just used these color bands here you can see on this male to opportunistically collect points on their distribution. And this work has worked pretty great in the past, but with this transmitter technology that we have, we can reduce the bias in sampling, because when you're looking for ʻAkiapōlāʻau, it's much easier to see them, say when they're like up in the thin branches of a koa tree, because they really stick out. You can see them a lot easier in those areas. But you may miss them when they're down in the sub canopy and in more difficult to see locations. And so by using these transmitters, we can reduce some of that bias in sampling their total area that they use. And then it allows for a little bit greater detail. So you can really follow them around over time and through several months. And so you can get a lot of points over longer period or over a set period of time, and that will really inform how the birds move throughout the year, as well as how they're using the habitat. And then it also allows you to explore new behaviors. So like ʻAkiapōlāʻau are thought to primarily reside in these koa dominant forests, but we may see some new behaviors that hadn't been seen before, or see them more often than have been seen in the past by using these transmitters. And then why is it important to look at habitat use? This is important because you can figure out what their preferred foraging species are, and then you can also identify priority areas. So maybe there's one spot where every single ʻAkiapōlāʻau in the population is going to, then you know that that's a really important area that needs to be protected. And then additionally, it can inform future management. Sorry, my lights just went out. You can inform future management decisions to determine what actions would be good to take in order to increase the population of the bird, or just better manage the area for the birds that are already there. And then bioacoustics. So what is bioacoustics and why do we want to know about it? So bioacoustics is biological sounds. It's any noise that's made that's related to biology. So it's songs, calls, screams, chirps, speech, etc. And these are really, bioacoustics is really important because it allows you to look at communication, and it also allows you to take a deep look at behavior. And what we're learning as things go on is that behavior is also a really important thing to conserve, whereas a lot of conservation is focused a lot on just conserving the population or the genetics. We also need to conserve differences in behavior within populations, especially these endangered birds where we have very limited numbers. And here's just a couple examples of what an ʻAkiapōlāʻau song looks like. So then here I kind of talked about this, but what can we learn about it? We can get ideas about their behavior, so like breeding behavior, territoriality, things like that. We can also look at song divergence. So if birds have very different songs based on their populations, that could mean that they're isolated, and so you could see some eventual speciation happening in that population. And then bioacoustics is also very valuable for estimating populations. So especially as we're developing new technologies such as machine learning that allow us to develop these algorithms to estimate bird abundance over area, it's really important to start looking at their vocalizations, because if we have really wildly different vocalizations, we have to tailor those algorithms in order to count birds in those places. And so that's why it's important to look at every population of ʻAkiapōlāʻau rather than just one or two. And then so for my study sites, I had one of my major study sites was at the Hakalau Forest National Wildlife Refuge on the eastern slope of Mauna Kea. And I mostly stayed in the replanted koa area because it's much easier to follow the birds around in that landscape. And then I also was working primarily at the Pu'umaka'ala Natural Air Reserve. And in this particular area, we were focusing mostly in this large kipuka in the northwest side of the NAR. It's Kipuka Waiakea, and we focused on this kipuka because it's largely koa and ohia dominated, and so it has a lot of endangered birds in the area, and is appropriate ʻAkiapōlāʻau habitat. And then for geographic song variation, I was actually really lucky to be able to work with some recordings that were recorded by Thane Pratt in the 1990s from this Kanaka-Leonui population of ʻAkiapōlāʻau, which unfortunately is now extinct. And so that's up on the east side of Mauna Kea in the Mauna Kea Forest Reserve within the Mamane Forest. And then we have, again, Pu'umaka'ala and Hakalau are my three areas of interest for looking at geographic song variation. So now part one, I'll really dive into the movement aspects, habitat use, and reproduction. So for hand tracking, we would capture the birds using playback and mist nets, and then we would attach these small radio VHF receiver transmitters that you can see here. And basically it's like a little leg loop backpack that we would put on the birds. And these transmitters would last for about 2 to 4 months, unless a lot of these female birds like to rip them off early, so we didn't quite get that much time depending on the bird. But generally that's what we were going for. Excuse me. And then what these do is they emit a little a sound, and you're able to, with the receiver, you're able to follow the birds to the forest and take points. And so for how we did that is we took a point every 30 minutes that we were following the bird, or when the bird moved 50 feet. And I can tell you from experience that generally ʻAkiapōlāʻau do not stay in one spot for 30 minutes. So most of the time we were taking a point every 50 minutes, or every 50 feet. I think I only got a point where the bird stayed in the tree for more than 30 minutes twice in the whole time I did this project. And then we took no more than 5 points per day, just so that we could take the points over a period of time to really capture the habitat use of the bird over time, rather than just in one set window of time. And then, so here's what we got. So for transmitter birds, we had 10 different individual birds that we were able to outfit with transmitters, and but we had 16 total birds that were color marked. So we were able to keep an eye on or take resights on these 16 birds, but for the transmitters, we just had the 10. And then over the course of this project, we had over 600 resight points, which you can see here, mostly in Pu'umaka'ala Natural Air Reserve, but a few of them actually ended up going down into the Upper Waiakea Forest Reserve. And then many of these birds were tracked over multiple years. So like this red bird here was first banded in 2016, and so we've been able to keep tabs on him all the way up through now here in 2020. And so these birds are pretty long-lived, and so we're able to follow their territories over time. And this, throughout that whole 4-year period, he stayed in this same home range. So and then from those points, I wanted to calculate what the home range was for these birds. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of variability. Some have these really, really tight home ranges. Others have these really large home ranges. But overall, the average, based on the transmitter resights, was about 26.24 hectares. And that's based off those 10 birds that I mentioned before. And then in order to kind of slim that down a little bit, I did a standard deviational ellipse to estimate home range. And so what this does is it encompasses 68% of the data. And so it gives you a little bit more of an idea of what their core home range will be. And so that estimate dropped down to about 15.23 plus or minus 19.76 hectares. And again, that's from the 10 birds that were wearing transmitters. And here I just want to point out too, there is, in this sample size, there's 3 females and there are 7 males. The 3 females are here in this, there's one here in this pink, in the yellow, and then in this purple color here. And then I also wanted to look at the birds that didn't necessarily have transmitters, but we had some data for. And so for each bird that we had at least 5 points of an individual resight on, I did another minimum convex polygon here. And so for this one, it was interesting. We got much, much smaller home range estimates. And again, this is probably just because we had these pretty small sample size of points. But even for some of the birds, like this red bird, we have like over 30 points over the course of time. It still had this pretty small home range compared to what you saw in the previous slides. And it ended up being about 6.07 hectares plus or minus 4.35 hectares. And that's based off of 8 birds that didn't have a transmitter at the time. And then I also wanted to look at male versus female to see if there's any significant differences in their home range size. And I didn't see anything that was unusual. They seemed to, basically the pairs would occupy the exact same home range. So there was no statistical difference between males and females as far as the size of the average home range that they held. And then, but one really interesting thing that I was able to pull out from this data was there was this pretty noticeable seasonal change in home range. And so this is one bird, this is one male bird here that we were able to transmitter twice. The first point set was between May through August, and then the second point set was between September and April. And so you can see that his home range really increased over that period. And when we look at all the birds that were tracked between those 2 time periods, we see that for the birds between September and April, the average home range size was much greater. It was about 47 hectares, whereas the May through August birds, it was only about 6 hectares. And so there's almost this 10-fold increase in home range size in what I'm calling the breeding and non-breeding season. So with September and April being the non-breeding and May through August being the potential breeding season. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. But this was a pretty interesting observation to see. And it also seems like they lose a lot of their territoriality response in this non-breeding period. There's a lot more overlap with birds showing up in other birds' territories, even though they're adult after third year individuals that have long had established territories. So it's pretty interesting to see that shift over time. And then, so just to kind of talk about this a little bit, so it does seem like the home range increases. It's a little bit irregular, but it does seem to be tied to the breeding or non-breeding season. And then it really increases dramatically between breeding and non-breeding. And so I'm wondering if there's potentially some sort of resource limitation, like maybe koa trees don't produce as much insect larvae in that non-breeding period as during the breeding period, but it's really interesting to see that their home range is going to increase by almost tenfold in response to something. And so I imagine it's some sort of habitat-based or resource-limited effect that causes it. And then from all of that, we can come up with a population estimate. So here's a nice pretty slide of a whole bunch of Aki. This is about 40 different individuals. And so basically what we can find is that the total area of the NAR that's above the mosquito line is about 1,650 hectares. And about 400 hectares of that is this mixed koa forest that seems to be favored by ʻAkiapōlāʻau. And so from our estimates, we can predict that there's about 40 to 50 adult ʻAkiapōlāʻau in the NAR currently. And one really exciting thing about Pu'umaka'ala is there's this ongoing restoration effort that's restoring about 200 hectares of former pasture. And so once that starts to grow out, I'd estimate that we could fit in an additional 20 birds into that area. So it's pretty exciting to see that. And then one thing, like I wasn't able to look at overlap very much because we did have some turnover, and so birds were kind of replacing and shifting. And so I wasn't exactly able to tie that into this analysis. And then going into habitat use, this is just a trees used by percentage of observation. So here you can see koa is definitely favored, but we had the trees that were documented used by ʻAkiapōlāʻau during this project were koa, ohia, olapa, naio, kolea, kawa'u, pilo, kolea lauli'i, and pukiave. And just recently, we actually observed one female using miley vines, which is kind of interesting. And then there's also this really interesting seasonal shift, and I think this might tie in to that same shift that we saw in home range, in the increase in home range size. And so from really from March all the way through October, there's this really high usage of koa, like upwards of 70%. And then, but once you get into October, November, December, January, it really drops off to about 50%. And then other plant species really peak in use. And I thought it would be tied mostly just to, like, we observed a lot of ʻAkiapōlāʻau foraging in Lehua. And so this is right around when Lehua is blooming in Pu'umaka'ala. But as you can see, they also forage in a wide variety of other species from in this time period as well, shifting a lot to ohia, olapa, and naio in particular. And so that was kind of an interesting thing. And it would be really interesting to get more information for September, October, February, because we have pretty limited data from those 3 months. So I think that's why it shows such high koa usage. But I would imagine that if we got a little bit more data from those 3 months, October would be more similar. October and February would be a little bit more similar to what we're seeing in November, December, and January. And so what you can see is very clearly from both of those graphs, koa is the dominant foraging tree, but there does seem to be this high use of olapa, naio, and kolea given their abundance. They're not very common trees, and it's pretty interesting to see, especially that seasonal shift where they start using these understory trees more than koa. And then again, like I was saying, there seems to be this spike in spring use of Lehua, and I think that's probably just because that's when that resource is abundant. But the interesting thing is when the birds are using this, they're actually leaving the safety of the large kipuka and this large koa dominant forest, and they're even foraging in this like really low stature ohia shrubland that kind of grows in between the major kipukas. And so that's been pretty interesting to see. Like you'll be walking around tracking the bird, and there'll be an ʻAkiapōlāʻau and an 8-foot tall ohia tree out in this really open landscape. And so it's pretty interesting to see that kind of behavior. And then also spending all this time with ʻAkiapōlāʻau, I was able to observe some kind of interesting breeding behavior. And this is really important for this species because less than 30 nests have ever been documented. And so anytime you can get a data point for this, it's worth collecting. And then we've also been keeping track of the first juvenile appearance, and then also looking at responsiveness to playback over time. And so over the course of this project, I was able to observe 3 different nests, 2 at Hakalau Forest National Wildlife Refuge and 1 at Puʻumaka'ala. Special thanks to Jessica Loeffler and Lance Tonino for finding 2 of those. And 1 nest was observed in June, 1 was in August, and 1 was in October. 2 were in koa trees, and 1 was in ohia. And then so as I watched the nests, I was able to do about 2,000 minutes of observation on the combined 3 nests. And what I saw is that females by and large were the bird coming in for most of the visits, and they were visiting about once every 28 minutes between the sexes. And one thing that does seem to be pretty interesting is on at least the 1 Hakalau nest that I was able to observe for a longer period of time. As the chick gets older, more and more the male starts taking over the role of primary feeder. So the female will be out for like 1 or 2 hours, and then the male will come in and feed the chick still in that continuous every 24 to 30 minute range. And so I think if you're able to watch the birds further and continue to watch them as they fledge, you would see the male take over more of the responsibilities for raising the chicks. And I think that's just a way that the birds have balanced the energy input, because the female does all of the incubation. And so the male probably picks up some of that responsibility later to kind of make up for that. And then for the sightings of juveniles in Puʻumaka'ala from 2016 to 2020, excuse me, we observed 18 different juveniles, and then at Hakalau we saw 6 different juveniles. And here you can see this is the appearance of the juveniles over time. So really from January through May, we didn't see any, and then June through August is really this peak month, especially August. Of the 18, 12 juveniles were first seen in August. And so that's I think, a very strong argument that this June through July period, or June through August period, seems to be their breeding period, and that seems to track well with the contraction in home range size as well as in resource use. And then there's also this little blip in October and November, and I'm pretty sure this is a result of a second breeding attempt. And this is just based off of 1 observation, but we did have 1 bird at Hakalau whose nestling was predated by a rat. And by the end of September, the male and female were engaging in courtship behavior once again. And so I believe that they probably renested, and then we observed their juvenile in October. So I'm pretty sure that was, for them, it was for sure a second nesting attempt. And so if that pattern holds, I think that's why we see this extra blip of the first appearance of juveniles in October and November. And then for playback response, this one was a little bit variable, but they're very, very responsive May through August. And again, I think this is highlighting that that's probably their breeding period, because they're really responsive to the playback. They come in really aggressively. And then there's also this slight response in October and early November. And I think this has to do with just the fact that there's chicks in the environment, and so they're a little bit more curious, and so they're kind of coming around. And then also it corresponds with that other peak in breeding activity. And so I think that's why we see this interest. And then from November through May, there's really not very much interest in the birds. Like, we caught very little. That's kind of why the data is pretty limited in those months. And then from there, we're going to dive into vocalizations here. And so here's another quick look at a ʻAkiapōlāʻau song and then a few calls. So in order to record the ʻAkiapōlāʻau, I used a handheld R07 recorder, and this is just a small little like cell phone sized recorder that's really easy to carry around through the field, and it allows you to record the birds as you're tracking them without having to carry a lot of extra equipment around with you as you go. And then I also use these automatic wildlife acoustic SM4 recorders. And these were just placed through the landscape to kind of look at seasonality of song and things of that nature. And as you can see, the birds approve. They left us a couple feathers to tell us what a good job we were doing recording them. But yeah, so those were the main methods we used for recording during this project. And then there was a couple differences between recording birds in Hakalau and at Pu'umaka'ala. So in Pu'umaka'ala, we had these banded birds that were wearing transmitters, but it was really difficult terrain and it was often hard to follow the birds. And by the time you got within range to make recordings, the birds had often flown away and were gone. And so it was difficult to get those recordings. And then at Hakalau, we were using unbanded birds, but what we did is we initially followed the pairs to find territories. And then this is really easy grassy terrain, and so it was really easy to follow the birds for long periods of time. And then we also were able to use nest locations and only included pairs because they're more territorial and less likely to be moving around. And so just to give a little bit more insight into how we did the recording at Hakalau for the bird territories. So what I did is I would go in beforehand and I would follow the birds for several hours and mark GPS points where I found them. And then I would come back to these same locations and the birds by and large were reliably found in these locations. And I know this for sure because there's a couple birds that had a few little identifiable characteristics, like one male was missing a toe. So I was able to kind of keep tabs on him. And then another bird had a nest, and so I could pretty much go back to that nest and be like, okay, the bird is here. And then some birds had juveniles, so it was easy to go in, find the juvenile, and be like, okay, that's the pair, and they're always in the same location. I do want to just highlight, like, it's not perfect, but because these birds are really territorial, it's possible to infer the identity of the individuals even without these color marks. And so here's just kind of a look at some of the songs. So Pu'umaka'ala, both of these songs are examples from Pu'umaka'ala. So here's the first one. Sorry, this one might be a little quiet. Yeah, hopefully that worked. And then here's the second one. Play that one more time. And then here's some examples of songs. Oh, I'm gonna play again, sorry. Here's some examples of songs from Hakalau. So here's the top song first. And you can see it has this repeated phrase. So this is where we saw a lot of the differences in ʻAkiapōlāʻau songs, was in these ending phrases. So they have these like shared components where they have these introductory notes, the body of the song, and then these shared phrases at the end. So this one was this kind of trilling phrase. This next song, I call it the barking phrase because you'll hear it's kind of like a little bark at the end of the song. And then there's this little like buzzy trill that they do as well here in this third song. And then for the Kanakaleo Nui birds, there wasn't a whole lot of song variation, but there was a couple songs. So here you can hear, and these songs are kind of interesting. Like they have, for those who are familiar with Palila, they have kind of a Palila-esque element to them. So here I'll go ahead and play these. So that's one bird, and then here's the other. So it's pretty interesting. So that's just kind of an example of what I was looking, or the different songs between the populations. And then so what I did is I looked at the repertoires of the birds. And so for Kanakaleo Nui, I had 67 total songs that were recorded. And this is from 2 individuals. And in all those 67 songs and between those 2 individuals, I was only able to identify 3 unique song types. And one of the birds had all 3 of those song types. The other one only had 2. And then if you look at Hakalau, I had over 211 total songs recorded from 5 individuals. And then from that, I was able to identify 15 different song types. And then the individual repertoires for each birds was 3 to 11 of those 15 song types. And they had a lot of shared songs between individuals. Same thing at Pu'umaka'ala, we had 153 total songs recorded from 8 individuals. And from that, we were able to find 17 different song types. And then for the individual repertoires, it ranged from 2 to 12 songs per bird. And one thing that's pretty interesting that you can see right off the bat is the Kanakaleo Nui birds only had a few individual song types. And I think this is probably a result of them being very limited in population. By the time Thane was out there monitoring this population, there's only a handful of birds left in that entire group. And so I think this is something similar to what they're seeing on Kauai. As you lose numbers of birds, you also lose song diversity. And so I think that's probably why we saw such a small amount of diversity in this population when compared to the 2 larger populations in Pu'umaka'ala and at Hakalau. And then, so to look at individual variation, I did these principal component analysis looking at the amount of difference between syllables. And so here, if I go back a little bit, sorry I didn't talk about this, but songs are composed of these different elements. So that's this green things here. And then the red marks the syllables. So some syllables are composed of multiple elements, whereas others are composed of only a single element. And this is how we can look at the songs really closely based on individual. And so what you can see is that there's not very much variation within the population. So most of the syllables, like there's definitely some differences in syllables, but the syllables are shared across the entire population, across all of the individuals. And so here you can see both in the Kanaka Nui, there's a little bit of difference here, but they're definitely sharing most of the syllables. Same thing here in Pu'umaka'ala, there's a little bit of differences here and there, but they're mostly sharing the syllables. And then at Hakalao, same situation, they're sharing a lot of these syllables, although this one, Aki 1, may have some unique syllables, but they're pretty much all about the same. So what we can conclude from this is that there's not very much individual variation within the populations that I was looking at. And then if you look at geographic variation, there's a little bit more of a breakout. So as expected, like the Kanaka Nui birds are very similar to one another. You can see them here. And then the Pu'umaka'ala birds are pretty similar, and the Hakalao birds are pretty similar. And so this really helps show that the variation in the songs is based on the geographic location of the population rather than variation within the individuals. And this has some implications for other honeycreeper species potentially here in Hawaii, because previous studies have found that different honeycreepers have these really different vocalizations in even small geographical areas. And so what it shows is that it's probably still potentially population-based rather than variation that the individual sings in a different location. And then, so just to kind of talk about the conservation implications for the vocalizations, this can really help identify isolated populations. So if you look at these different unique bird groups, you can see that there's these different, there's these isolated songs. Like as I showed you in the previous slides with those 3 different song groups, they're all pretty different. You know, like there's even like the Hakalao to the Pu'umaka'ala birds, which at one point were probably connected. There's quite a bit of variation within those songs, and so we can come to the conclusion that those populations don't mix very much. So those are probably isolated. And then it also emphasizes the importance of conserving populations. So if we know that they have these differences, we can then take more action to conserve them. So unfortunately with the Kanaka Nui birds and the birds in the Mauna Kea Forest Reserve as a whole, we didn't really know this information until later, and unfortunately those populations are now gone. And so now it's really in our best interest to continue to conserve these birds as best as we can, and to conserve not only the populations where they're doing well, such as in Pu'umaka'ala or in Hakalao, but also in areas where the birds are not as studied or may not be doing as well, such as in Ka'u. And then it also helps us develop a better understanding of behavior, and as well as its implications for management and conservation. And so what we learned from studying these birds over time is that they do seem to have this breeding period where they are more vocal or more responsive to vocalizations. And it's actually much later than when we typically do forest bird surveys. And so to put it in reference, in Pu'umaka'ala, we've only been able to ever document as many as 9 individuals in the forest bird counts, when in actuality, there's probably more like 40 or 50 birds based on the results of this project. And so I think that's something that can really be taken into regard. I mean, it would be difficult, obviously, to do an additional survey period, but for ʻAkiapōlāʻau, perhaps in the future, if we wanted to get a better population estimate, we could do surveys, say, in June, July, and August, rather than in the early spring that has been done for most of the other forest bird populations across the state. And then, as I mentioned before, this can also inform development of machine learning algorithms for automatic detection. So as technology advances, there's a lot more opportunity for these automated systems to be placed out on the landscape in order to record birds, and then it can give us like real-time population estimates throughout the year. And so because we're seeing that these birds have these different different vocalizations in these different populations, it's really important to look at that and include that in possible algorithms for these different detection methods, so that we can better tailor these remote survey options to count and document these birds on the landscape. And then, so talking about a little bit of the conservation implications of tracking. So tracking can have a big impact on the birds. You know, we're putting this backpack on, but it's only about 3% of their body weight, so it doesn't seem to bug them very much. But it is still a take on the bird, and so we really want to like talk about what is important, what important information we're learning from this. And I think the big one is we're getting a more detailed look at habitat use over time. So now we know, like in the past, we knew that ʻAki really liked koa. But now there seems to be this seasonal shift where they'll actually shift away from koa a little bit and start foraging on these understory species. And this has a really big, this helps identify like some of the priority tree species for restoration. And it has a pretty big impact because a lot of restoration efforts here in Hawaii have focused primarily on regenerating koa. And what we're seeing is that ʻAkiapōlāʻau, while koa is definitely their dominant foraging species, they also rely on these other understory species and on ohia, depending on the time of year. And so for future restoration efforts, it would be really good to try to incorporate additional understory species in order to really maximize the amount of birds that we can potentially get moving into these zones. And then this also helps us determine the number of birds that can be supported by management areas. So we now know that there's probably around 40 to 50 adult individuals in Pu'umaka'ala. And from that we can say, so based on this, because we're operating primarily in this old growth forest, and so if we look at other old growth forest areas across the island, we can now estimate a little bit more accurately approximately how many birds may be living in those areas. Especially in areas that are protected from ungulates and other threats. And then again, it can also predict the number of birds that can be sustained in restoration areas. So based off of this number, based off of the density that we got in this current forest, we can then predict that there is potentially going to be another 20 birds from the restoration efforts in Pu'umaka'ala, for instance. And then it'll also provide greater insights for conserving remaining unmanaged forest areas, because there are currently populations of ʻAkiapōlāʻau that are not receiving very much management. And so now that we know that they do have this variation across populations in their vocalizations, it really emphasizes the importance of trying to conserve these unprotected populations, especially as I was saying in Ka'u. And then it can also, one other thing that we have been noticing in Pu'umaka'ala is there's this potentially high turnover of banded individuals. And so this isn't, this is just like individuals that have been marked. So we have some birds that have lived for a long period of time, but in other birds have been, their territories are taken over by another bird. And this is after they've dropped the transmitter, so it's not transmitter related, but we have seen several birds disappear over the course of this project, and where you'd think they would be more long-lived, including one male that was for sure predated by a rat. And so that's one thing that perhaps we could improve management techniques over time in controlling predators, and that's something that may be in the works. So hopefully we'll see this turnover rate slow down as additional management measures are implemented across the landscape. And then just to kind of talk about some future research directions, I think collecting vocalizations of ʻAkiapōlāʻau from the other 3 populations that are known, especially from Keauhou Ranch, the Ka'u Forest Reserves, especially Kapapala, and then the limited Kipuka populations would be really valuable for looking at how isolated those populations are, as well as if there's any unique elements to those that are different from the populations we evaluated in this project. And then it would be really good to evaluate the abundance of tree species in Kulani. So like from generally I can say like there's less olapa, less kolea, less nio on the landscape, but I really want to, it would be nice to go in and actually evaluate that to give us, to really tackle the question of relative importance of those species for ʻAki. Like we know they're using them, but how important are they on the landscape basically? And then collecting additional vocalizations from both Hakalau and Kulani, because Kulani has kind of 2 populations of, Kulani is referring to Pu'umaka'ala, by the way, sorry if I didn't clear that up. But Kulani has these two populations of birds, so it might be interesting to see how even those like fairly close together populations vary. And then color banding the Hoʻokalāʻau individuals would also be really useful because it'll give us this definite identity, but I'm pretty confident that we were able to capture just those particular individuals that I was looking at. And then finally, I think evaluating the prey abundance in different tree species throughout the year would provide some really important information regarding the foraging preference of ʻAkiapōlāʻau in the NAR. And so I think that would be really important to look at over time, and it might explain why we're seeing this increase in home range size. So like maybe koa trees have less insects living in them in the spring and winter, and Olapa and Nayo have more, and so that's why Aki maybe are shifting. Or maybe there's just less resources overall, so that's why Aki are using a wider variety of trees in their foraging preferences. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for coming here today. I really appreciate you coming. Sorry if I talked a little bit quickly. And then I really want to just thank all the ʻAkiapōlāʻau that let me follow them around the forest. I couldn't have done that without them. Hawaii Island NARS, Alex Wong, and Tanimoto Johnson, the USGS, Evan Paxton, Jessica Loeffler, Lila Freed, the Pacific Island Program for Exploring the Sciences, Timon Skinner, and Caleb Cow. Thank you all very much for your assistance in this project. It really helped it come together. And I really want to thank too just everyone who's contributed to the study of ʻAkiapōlāʻau over time, from early Hawaiians to the early scientists that came here and worked with this incredible species. So with that, mahalo, and as Pat said, if you want to learn more about Hawaiian birds, you should consider following my social media pages at Birds Hawaii Past Present on Facebook and Instagram. And with that, I think I can open it up to questions.
Thanks, Brett. Nice job.
I'm going to put headphones in so I can hear people better.
I have a question, Brett.
Okay.
First of all, congrats. Good job. And hi.
Thank you.
So I noticed that the home range of several birds overlap, and you have said that the pairs tend to have home ranges that are pretty similar. Do their home ranges then, well, I don't know if they mate for life or not.
Yeah,
so,
they seem.
Okay.
Anyway. Let me get to that slide for you here. Okay. I mean, so far we've seen that they typically stay together. So this red bird and this yellow bird were a pair at one point. And so that's why they're overlapping quite a bit. But currently she's one of the birds that is not present anymore. And he actually repaired with this pink bird. So you can see they completely overlap. And the red male and the yellow female overlapped quite a bit as well. And then this blue bird, he was just kind of foraging all over the place, but he seems to be kind of living down here in this bottom section below the yellow circle now. So I think when we tracked him, it was in that spring period when they were just moving all over, and that's why there's a lot of overlap. But when it came to the breeding season, he was nowhere to be found, at least within this bird's territory. Like it definitely moved down. But yeah, all these birds that are overlapping are generally pairs or birds that have moved in to take over an empty territory. So this gray and purple bird were a pair, and this blue bird moved in after the gray bird disappeared. And so that's kind of why there's a little bit of overlap happening, in addition to just the pairs.
And are the juveniles also?
We actually, for tracking, we don't have any juveniles in this data set. So, but the juveniles would also, like, of the resites that we have for juvenile birds, they're generally in their parents' habitats. And the juvenile Aki actually have this really long period of parental care. So they'll typically stay with their parents for 6 to up. Jack Jeffrey recently observed one bird that stayed with its parents for 18 months. So they'll stay with their parents for a pretty significant amount of time.
All right, thanks, Bret.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Hi, Bret.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Paul.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Bret, what do you suppose happens to the individual's repertoire during the breeding season? Would you predict that it gets wider, or do you think it gets more narrow?
That's a good question. I didn't look at that in the course of this project, but I would guess, because like typically when I would get the most variation in their songs is when they would be counter singing. So like whenever you'd have like two males that are on the edges of their territories and they start counter singing, that's when they get a lot more diversity in their songs, and they start singing because like I was showing you, like at ʻAkiapōlāʻau, there's like those three major types where they have like the little barks, the little trill, and then the little like buzzy sounds. They would do all three of those in that song when they were singing against another male. And so I would think that it probably increases during the breeding season rather than gets more specific, just because they're doing a little bit more song battling between neighboring males. But again, I'd have to look at that to answer that specifically.
Well, if I could follow up quickly, just along the same lines, do you think that males that are in adjacent territories would have more or less similar repertoires compared to males that are not in close proximity?
Yeah, I think it definitely seems like they have similar repertoires between neighbors. Again, that was something I didn't exactly look at, but they definitely, like when I was looking at like what songs were shared between birds, neighbors almost always had the same songs across the group. So like for instance, this red bird here and this green bird had very, very similar songs because they're neighboring. Whereas this bird that was a little bit further away had slightly different vocalizations, but his were more similar to like one of the birds down here. And so I'm guessing that he was probably one of the chicks of one of these two individuals and then moved up when this habitat opened up or something like that. But yeah, so it definitely seems like the proximity to neighbors has an influence on their vocalizations. But again, I'd have to look at that a little bit more, especially I think at ʻAkiapōlāʻau would be a great place to look at that in that koa forest, because they're a lot more concentrated and it's really easy to follow those individuals around. So that would be a great place to try to target that question as well.
Yeah, thank you. I guess that raises the question in Thane's study at Kanakaleʻanui, where it seems as though there's a smaller repertoire, but also smaller sample size. Maybe those are very highly related birds that learned basically the same repertoire.
Yeah, and I think that's what I would guess for that population, just because there are so few of them and there's not much to compete with. And I think had I done more sampling at ʻAkiapōlāʻau, there probably would have been greater song variability. But I just, in the course of this project, I wasn't able to capture everything that was found there. But just because the population of birds seems to be so much greater there than in Puʻumaka'ala. So I would expect over time you'd find more song variability there. But yeah, unfortunately, over the course of this project, I wasn't able to capture everything.
Well, thank you. Great job too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. Appreciate it.
Brett, we had someone raise their hand, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, but I think it's Jan Lepsen.
Is Jan here?
Or not. Okay.
No, Jan?
Oh, I think he's muted.
Can you unmute him?
Okay,
There we
can
go.
you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you.
Okay, yeah, this is good work. I really enjoyed the work on the repertoires and individual variation. That's stuff I wish I could have done myself. I worked at ʻAkiapōlāʻau about 30 years ago, and I will, as an aside, say Pat Hart is dressed just the same as he did 30 years ago. But they were just starting the forest restoration above the camp where I used to live. And so my understanding is the birds you were looking at are all in these like 30-year-old koa forests that have just regenerated since then.
Yeah, for the most part, the birds at Hawkalow were all like basically within a mile of the cabin, the admin area.
Mhm.
Yeah, and there's really good numbers of birds there now. So they're pretty easy to find. Like even like you'll be sitting in the UH cabin and that you can see them from the windows in the kitchen sometimes.
Okay,
So
really cool. So they're actually nesting in like the 30-year-old forest now?
Yeah, they're actually nesting there. The one nest that I found is right on the top fence line. There's one koa tree just inside the Hawkalow fence, and the nest was in that tree.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
Good. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. I love the pictures too.
Yeah, thank you.
Good to see you, Jan.
Yeah, hi.
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, I guess I'm really curious about the song and syllable classification since I did a whole heck of a lot of that. Great job, by the way, Bret.
Thank you.
So excited to see this. But yeah, I was curious about how you classify the different song types. Is there like any variation within a song type? And is the difference between types pretty much just those like end syllables? Do the songs generally have the same number of elements, or is there variation in that? I was just curious about that.
Yeah, so a lot of the variation. So like there's like this really like for the trilly song at Hawkalow, you know, that has the repeated notes at the end of the song and that long phrase. Those ones, so it would basically be almost the identical song beforehand, and then you would have just varying numbers of those notes at the end. So I classified each one of those as a different song, even though they're really similar, just to try to pull out any variation at all. And then again, yeah, just kind of looking at, so there was a lot of, so basically if a song type, it had to be, each song was unique, basically, of those song types. When I was looking at, let's see, maybe I can pull that up. Let me find it here. But yeah, so I basically categorized each song as if it had any variation at all. So a lot of times they would remove one syllable or add a syllable. That I would classify that as a unique song type. But generally, there's a lot of shared syllables and songs across individuals, especially in the different populations. So yeah, hopefully did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. Okay. I guess also kind of following up, you talked about you know, variability in the syllables across different individuals. So I was also curious about like, how do the syllables vary? Are they it's like, is there variation in the shape of them, or what were you looking at there?
Yeah, I think, so for the syllables, I traced each one individually. And so the program was kind of able to break those apart and look at variability. But like you can see, like there's a few, like I wonder, let me see if I can share screen again. Sorry. So with
making
this,
you work hard.
Yeah, I'm just trying to play with the technology here, which always gets dangerous. But yeah, so what you can see is like there is quite a bit of difference in like the syllable shape. So here's just like Hawkalow, for instance, like even in the main body of the song, like almost all of these syllables are different from this other song right below it. Although you can see like this end syllable before the ending is about the same. And then same thing with a few of these syllables that tend to be shared across different song types. But there does seem to be a lot of individual syllables that are only found in one song type over the other, if that makes sense.
Cool.
So yeah, there's more variability in the songs than I thought there would be, just like based on hearing them audioly. You know, like Aki sound like pretty much like an Aki wherever you hear them, but there is quite a bit of variation even within the populations.
Right on, awesome. Thanks, Bret.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Hey, did Thane Pratt have a question somewhere? Are you here, Thane?
Yeah, thanks very much, and great job, Bret. I really enjoyed the presentation. This is marvelous.
Yeah, thank you, Thane. Appreciate it.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask was you caught and banded a number of juvenile birds. Did you get any indication as to what the juvenile settlement pattern might be like? Did they all just move out, or did some of them end up settling in on your study site?
So far, every banded individual juvenile that we've had has dispersed out of the study site. So we don't know where they went. Actually, recently we just caught, so I'm still working on some of this as part of NARS. We're kind of expanding the work. And we recently caught this juvenile bird, which I don't know if you can see is on Alex's screen right now. And so hopefully that one we were able to fit with a transmitter, and it's a longer lived transmitter. So hopefully we'll be able to tackle some of those questions. But for now, it seems like most of the juvenile birds have dispersed completely out of our study site. And after that 8-month period where they're with their parents, we haven't seen them again. Okay. But I mean, birds are filling in from somewhere. So yes, they must be just dispersing somewhere else in the NAR, or maybe they're going below down into the forest reserve. It's kind of hard to say for sure, but it does seem like the birds pretty much for the most part leave their natal forest area and go pretty far. So
great. Well, thank you.
But yeah, that would definitely be a really cool thing to look at in the future, though. So hopefully, yeah, like I was saying, hopefully that's something we can look at NARS a little bit more.
Okay, great. Yeah, go Akis.
Yeah, exactly.
I apologize to everybody. I don't know how to raise my hand with Zoom, but I would if I could. I'll just butt in otherwise. Bret, as a student of bird vocalizations, what can you say about, in general, the vocalization patterns, repertoires, whatever, of highly territorial species versus species that are not so territorial?
You know, I haven't looked a whole lot into that, but just based off of looking at Aki, which like I would consider fairly territorial at this point, it seems like they get more vocal as like you're getting into breeding or other key traits. So like maybe if food becomes limited, I would guess that they would become much more vocal. Or as they're competing for mates, they would become much more vocal. Whereas like things you look at like ʻApapane, they just sing all the time. You know, like there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason for why they're singing. They're just singing to sing. And so I think that's kind of what I would guess. And like you see similar things with ʻAlipaʻau, like they're pretty quiet unless another bird like shows up, and then they get all riled up and will make a lot more vocalizations. And so I think it'd probably be patterns along that, but yeah, again, I didn't exactly look at that, but it would be really interesting to compare, say, the vocalization phenology of ʻAkiapōlāʻau with something like ʻApapane and ʻIʻiwi that are much less territorial.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Well, then maybe I can take one more shot at it.
Yeah.
Anybody but Paul?
Yeah, it's not really a question, but you know, I think you're on the right track to want to look at the availability of insect prey in the different host trees. But I would also encourage that mamane, don't overlook mamane, even though you know there's no more birds in that pure mamane habitat anymore, but it was, and I think continues to be a big provider of insects for ʻAkiapōlāʻau.
Yeah, especially like if it would be really cool to look like, I know in Keauhou there's quite a bit of mamane mixed into that music forest there. So it'd be really neat to look at how if they're using that that tree species, because yeah, unfortunately, like in Puʻumakala, there's really not any mamane growing, and so I was never able to observe them using that species. But yeah, I'm sure it's a really important species in other areas of their range. That's again where it would be really interesting to look in like in the top of the Ka'u Forest Reserve and in Keauhou.
Great, thanks very much.
Well, I see there are some questions in the chat, but most of them, Bret, were from Elliot, who's on your committee.
Oh.
So we could probably get to those after this in your committee meeting, I would imagine.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I missed.
Yeah, you might want to stop the recording too. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
You asked me to remind you, so a little late. But